Since the 12-day war, Iran has fallen out of the news a little bit, but it's still there. It's still a critical country, and U.S.-Iran relations loom very large in both Washington and in Tehran. So our panel today is going to look at the U.S.-Iran relationship, decades of misunderstanding, question mark. I think at the end of this session, we'll take that question mark away. So we couldn't have two better speakers to talk about U.S.-Iran relations. First of all, we have Professor Vali Nasr, who is who's the Majid Khadduri Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. I think he was dean there as well at one point. Vali is a really prolific author. If you Google him, you'll see that he's written many seminal works on the Middle East, and his most recent book, Iran's Grand Strategy, is a must-read for those of you interested in understanding Iran and its place in the region and in the world. And it's a fresh look, goes beyond theocracy to look at Iran's national strategy. Our second speaker is Ambassador Barbara Leaf, who is currently a senior international policy advisor at the law firm of Arnold and Porter. She's had a long, distinguished career as a diplomat in the U.S. government, including most recently as Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs and also as U.S. Ambassador to the UAE. She, relevant to the discussion today, she was the first director of the State Department's Office of Iranian Affairs back in 2006. So we're going to talk for about an hour, focusing on U.S.-Iran relations, and then at 5:30, we'll take questions from you. So let me start. I want to ask each of you the same question, which is, since we're talking about relations between Washington and Tehran, Vali, what are the two key assumptions that the Iranians have about the U.S.? And I'll ask Barbara the same question. What are two key assumptions that the U.S. has about Iran, and how did these assumptions develop? Maybe I'll start, Vali, with you.
Thank you very much, Gary. Let me first thank the Crown Center and Brandeis for inviting me, and it's great to be here with Ambassador Leaf and with Gary, who I know from a long time back. We were at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he was my boss there, actually. And it's wonderful to be back. At least based on one of the reasons I wrote this book was to look at what are sort of the more abiding structural, if you would, assumptions of Iran rather than assumptions at any one point in time. And I think, going back to the revolution, I think the fundamental assumption is one that what the revolution was about in many ways in the minds of those who carried it out, whether they were secular or religious at the beginning, was that the revolution was about gaining Iran's genuine independence, believing that Iran had been under the thumb of the United States since 1953, and that the United States, therefore, still remains the greatest threat to Iran's independence. And you have to try to keep the U.S. out of Iran, away from Iran, as far away from its borders. And secondly, a belief that the United States will never accept or agree to Iran's revolutionary government. And this, I think, has been reinforced in their mind, I would say, and I emphasize this not as a sort of an objective observation, but in their mind, in their own terms, every time that they have come close and things haven't worked. So let's say the nuclear deal we signed, we did our part. The U.S. was not really interested in moving forward, and this time we were at the table, and they turned the table upside down and attacked us. So, end of the day, this is not about a nuclear deal. It's not about one or two things. It's about the fact that it's about regime change. What we call regime change to them means not accepting the legitimacy or of the Islamic Republic or of the revolution. So, and particularly, I would say, just as a last word, that in the mind of Iran's supreme leader, that is particularly strong. And after all, he's the longest-serving Iranian ruler, one of the longest-serving Iranian rulers since mid-19th century, and although he's not an absolute ruler, nevertheless, particularly on national security and Iran's relations with the United States, his imprint on Iran's attitude, et cetera, is particularly strong. And he genuinely holds on to this view, that the U.S. will not accept us, that we cannot trust it, and that the U.S. is a threat to Iran's independence.
Thank you, Barbara. What about from the U.S. perspective? What are the assumptions that U.S. policymakers have about Iran?
So I want to echo what Vali said. My thanks to Brandeis and the Crown Center for this great event, and for Gary, for you doing the moderating here. Look, going back to my days before I was really dragged into the Middle East, I was, very much fixated on the Soviet Union and Russia, and so there'll be a little bit of mirror imaging that you hear as Vali and I talk about these two adversaries and how they look at the other. I would say across administrations, going back to 1979, there has been a sort of a through line of assumptions by U.S. officials that the Iranian regime is irreconcilably focused on Israel's destruction and is implacably opposed to the U.S. And a corollary to that is that Iran has acted consistently as an agent of destruction in the broader Middle East. I would just, if I might, if you would bear with me, I'd like to add Barbara Leaf's two longstanding assumptions. The curious thing is that their regional strategy, and I was really struck by that reading your book, Vali, has not really altered from one presidential transition to another, and we've had some really dramatic shifts in presidents, from Jimmy Carter to Reagan, from the Reagan-Bush to Clinton, from Clinton to Bush, Bush to Obama, et cetera, and then, of course, Trump. But I think fundamentally my second guiding assumption is that the Iranians themselves the regime has never really, it has consistently failed to understand how its sort of obsession or enrobing of its nuclear program in secrecy and some specific elements of it, the highly enriched uranium quest, are themselves the pieces that have really driven U.S. and international either suspicion or absolute conviction that Iran is destined to go after a nuclear weapon.
So you both, you set the stage for this conversation by talking about these fundamental areas of tension or conflict between the U.S. and Iran. Iran believing that the U.S. was determined to destroy the revolution, overthrow the government, and the U.S. believing that Iran was a force for instability and threats to U.S. friends in the region. So how do you think, are these views that do you think they can be altered, or do you think that this is so fundamentally a part of both the Iranian and the American DNA, which has lasted since 1979, so that really breaking those areas of disagreement is not a realistic prospect? Go ahead, Vali.
There's one theory that you would say that change can come incrementally without you intending a big change. Let's say if the nuclear deal had survived and something else had been built on it, et cetera, even Iran, despite itself, might have gone down a road that would have gradually got it to a different place with the United States. But partly the history of the relationship between the two countries is a history of false starts. In other words, when the U.S. has been more ready, Iranians haven't been. When the Iranians have, the U.S. hasn't been. And so we haven't really had the closest we came was the nuclear deal, because it's a time that actually they both met. They both signed something. They were going down a path of at least implementing it. And then it was abruptly cut off. And the way it was cut off actually increased distrust, at least on the Iranian side. There's another way to think about it, which is that, I think the person of Ayatollah Khamenei is a lot like, you would say, Mao or Brezhnev. I mean, he's the person whose views have basically organized Iran's foreign policy the way it is. And nothing fundamentally will change until you have a true generational shift in the Islamic Republic. And we may be on the cusp of that just because of his age, etc. And thirdly, I would say, one of the points I make about this book is that we don't see it this way maybe, but Iran, in a way, in its own mind, has been at war for 45 years. This has never stopped with the US, basically. The war could be hot war, cold war, economic war, but this is a country which I think every aspect of it has been organized around waging this war, right? From its economy to its society to even authoritarianism internally in order to protect against velvet revolution supposedly being managed from the outside. And so now we are at a point where it is a real question whether this is sustainable, right? Economically sustainable, even as a strategy if it's sustainable. Even the nuclear issue you mentioned, the way they've gone about it has not prevented war. It has actually invited war. It has not lifted sanctions. It has invited more sanctions. And I think the country as a whole is at a point where I don't think it thinks its fundamental assumptions about the US is wrong, but it's reached a point that this may no longer be sustainable. And I think that's the biggest reason why they might be changed, because whether you take a baby step towards changing your behavior or a big step towards changing your behavior, I guess this is at the moment when Mao said, okay, Nixon should come to China, right? Or Kissinger should come to China. He didn't intend to end the revolution, but it was a moment of, you would say, strategic desperation, which started something. And I think Iran is there. I think one of the we're probably not because of anything that the US is putting on the table, but I think the realities of where the country is with its strategy is that it is not really showing success, and it's and as I said, it may no longer actually be really sustainable.
Can that change come while the supreme leader is still alive?
No, I think actually, ironically, and we can talk about this more, I think that change in Iran has started in a very, very big way. I mean, the level of debates you're seeing in Iran about whether we should talk to the US and even give up the nuclear program versus, on the other hand, we should go full tilt in the direction of nuclearization, debate about, how do we actually defend this country, just on purely military terms. Like, what's your with Hezbollah gone, now what's your actually line of defense? How are you going to go against the world's two most advanced militaries? One is superpower, the other one a truly advanced military. How are you actually going to do that? The answer to that may be, well, we can't. And if you say you can't get there. Then the economic situation is also, you have these massive debates about what to do about an economy that is now gone back under even more sanctions. And then at the social level, for instance, the Islamic Republic has just basically given up completely on enforcing Islamic strictures, hijab. I think that is perhaps the most fundamental shift there is. It's not at the nuclear table, it's not on the kinds of things that we would like to see, but how much bigger change could you expect in a country if it actually gave up on that? It's equivalent of if Mao had said, okay, from tomorrow capitalism is okay. Then, so I think Iran is in a very peculiar place that it's not declaratively past that moment, but in many ways the level of debate and particularly at the social cultural level, the transformation in the country is already pointing to where it's going.
So, Barbara, you've seen, as you said, secretaries of state and presidents have come and gone, and they've taken, or at least thought they were taking, different approaches to deal with Iran. There's the hardline approach, which is that there are irreconcilable differences, only pressure and threats work, and then others have said, let's try to come to an understanding, let's try to improve relations. So I want you to talk a little bit about what you've seen in terms of that internal American debate and discussion.
This point that you made, Vali, about, the two never being in the same place ready, I always thought of it as, the sort of minuet that was off. When one stepped forward, the other was stepping back. They were never in sync about which direction they wanted to go. And I think that was particularly striking throughout the 90s, especially, when Mohammad Khatami was in office. I think through that period and then in the early 2000s, it struck me that when the U.S. made gestures, even of a very tactical kind, and this was the case during some of the very heated early phase of Iraq's descent into civil war, and Iranian-backed militias were targeting U.S. troops. And we tried to come up with a sort of scheme to have an engagement that would just be opening a channel so that we would not get into a direct conflict. And it seemed to both tantalize but alarm the Iranian side. And we've seen that through earlier such issues. Because what you said earlier, the U.S. being, this pillar of the revolution for the supreme leader, the U.S. being this great Satan, but beyond that sort of moniker, really being this sort of taint for the revolution that the supreme leader and others in the regime just did not want to have that proximity. So I would say that it struck me consistently that that the messaging was consistent on the Iranian side. It perhaps to Iranian ears sounded consistent on the U.S. side, but when I think back to the period of time under Clinton, later period under Bush, certainly Obama, you didn't have that kind of messaging. You had, maybe it was sort of trite, but always you had the messages, the cultural messages, the Nawaz messages, the sort of clumsy at times outreach, but as we moved from just concerns over the regional issues to the nuclear, of course, that became more fraught. The thing that I've been thinking about as I thought about today was Americans are often accused rightly of not really being students of their own history and certainly not of world history. And that's in some ways, when I think about Iran, it's kind of an advantage in that even that neuralgic point in history for Americans, the 1979 hostage taking, is almost out of the national memory, except for people in their 70s and older, 60s and 70s. But for young people, they're vaguely aware that something happened once upon a time, but they didn't live it. You ask any American, what about 1953? They'll have no idea what you're talking about. Now, that's where it's a disadvantage, because Americans do not understand how that history frames not just the leadership, but certain key parts of society. But when I think about, is it possible to imagine a world in which we find some sort of indirect and then direct discussion point and eventually to get to some sort of détente? I think it's absolutely possible because we're not particularly weighed down by historical baggage. We are very consumed with other things, mostly consumed with ourselves these days. Even once we move past this administration, I think the next administration is not going to be particularly preoccupied with Iran. Iran is very preoccupied with us, no question, but that's a mismatch too.
Can I just add something? I fully agree with Barbara, but I wanted to say from the Iranian side also the lessons they have taken all along. I mean, obviously they were never, and I don't think they still are not at the leadership level ready for normalization. This is really, and détente
Yes.
is the right word, which is they're looking for an arms control deal
Yes.
on the model of the ones that we did with the Soviets, which we can have an agreement, but this doesn't mean that we're normalizing. But I also think that the lesson that they've learned is that the only way that they get U.S. attention is also by escalating pressure. So the nuclear issue became kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it got them into more trouble. But on the other hand, they also understood the only way you get a superpower to actually pay attention to you is that you have to have something on the table that is worth their while. And they will punish you for Hezbollah, they will punish you for varieties, but they're not going to actually negotiate with you to lift sanctions over Hezbollah. The only issue they may actually engage you is over the nuclear issue. So, in their telling, President Obama put sanctions on Iran that brought them to the table. In their telling, they also went from 190 centrifuges when Rouhani wanted to negotiate in 2003 to 119,000 centrifuges when President Obama decided he needs to go to the table. And in an ironic way, the biggest champion of Iran's strategy was Bibi Netanyahu. Because every time he would say they're only 2 months away and I'm going to go to war, Washington would mobilize to how to defuse this. And so actually where we are is very interesting because President Trump may assume they have nothing to play with. So why would I pay him any attention, right? You're right. I mean, he has other fish to fry, and he says, okay, I bombed their leverage, so leave him alone. I don't need to pay any attention. And I think the Iranian inclination might be that we need to do something to disabuse him of that assumption, and then you end up again in this escalatory cycle of one side trying to pressure the other one in an unproductive way.
If I could just make
Please.
2 points. One, I meant to say Nowruz, and I muffed it. I'm very tired. I didn't sleep very well last night, so if you wondered what I was referring to, there's, the thing that has been consistent over, as you said, the war that Iran has been waging, that has been the the impact on American thinking across even administrations that started with the notion of let me see if I can reset this thing, let me see if I can take a different stab at it. And so the global effort, the targeting in Lebanon and Iraq, in Saudi Arabia in the 90s of U.S. forces, U.S. facilities, and then more recently, post the killing of Soleimani, the targeting, and it was real. I mean, the targeting of a whole slew of U.S. officials from the first Trump administration for assassination. Like as with the nuclear piece, the Iranians, to my mind, and to American officials' minds, they're living in this mental landscape where they are not connecting the dots between hostility from Washington because a building's been blown up, an embassy's been blown up twice in a year and a half, and so on. So why ask why? So, to the degree that Washington is not so fixated on Iran right now, I agree with you, it's a danger. If President Trump or his envoys think that largely the matter is resolved and they don't need to go back at it. But I think, I hope you're right that there's beginning to be a rethink in the aftermath of what has been a devastating 2 years for them. That maybe there's a different set of cards to play than that.
One of the difficulties in the relationship has been mixed signals from both sides. And of course, when you deal with Iran, there's a very sophisticated, urbane, reasonable diplomatic corps that talks about, improving relations and resolving issues. And then there's another part of the regime which plots to assassinate current and former American officials. And I'm sure the same is true with the U.S. From Iran's standpoint, they're hearing different voices. So talk a little bit about, why don't you start, Barbara? Talk a little bit about
How much we how much expertise we have or
Yes.
don't have? Yes, I'd love to dive into that. So look, when I was asked to take over the new Office of Iranian Affairs that my deputy, soon-to-be deputy, Henry Wooster, was busily setting up in summer of 2006, I did not have Iran expertise, and nor did most of the people who staffed that first office. Henry was one of 1.5 officers, desk officers, dedicated to Iran in the department in 2006. And the whole reason the office was tasked to be set up the previous year was because when the new Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, came into the building, she asked Nick Burns, the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, okay, let's look at our adversaries. How many people do we have working on the DPRK? How many people do we have working on Iran? The answer came back on North Korea. Across the building, a collection maybe of 60-some people doing all the different elements of policy. On Iran, it was kind of 1.5 people. There was no office for Iranian affairs. And if you know state, you know that's how you pull all the strands of policy making together, programmatics if you've got any, and how you also keep retaining and building a cadre of people who speak the language of a given country or know the culture of the region, et cetera. So we had none of that, and we had not had really anything for years, as you know, from the time of 1981 when we got our hostages back. The embassy was closed for good until 25 years later. We had just whittled down to virtually nobody in the department who had any expertise or the language or anything else. So Henry, helped design something that was built on the old George Kennan Riga station model, which was, we didn't have an embassy in Moscow between the time of the revolution till the early 30s. We needed to keep eyes on events that were occurring within Russia. We needed to have people who had the language and who were meeting with Russians. They did it offshore in Riga. And so we set up an office in Dubai. We did a constellation of Iran watchers in about 6 or 8 places. And then we had the office. And we also grew a program of cultural and educational sports exchanges, well, one-way exchanges, bringing Iranian athletes and artists and journalists over. So, as I said, there were a few people within that mix. Alan Eyre, of course. Bill Sammy is still within the department, is superb on Iran. Gillian Burns, Suzanne Maloney at one point worked in the department in NEA. But we built that up over time, and the whole logic of those external staffing pieces was that they would meet with Iranians, not official Iranians, because we had a very strict no contact or de minimis contact with Iranian officials. But everybody else was fair game, and they were encouraged to go out, use their Farsi, and so forth. The logic behind that, too, was eventually over time, and here we are 19 years later, you have a cadre of people who could staff Embassy Tehran again, if we ever have Embassy Tehran.
So what we do have in the U.S. is a community of Iran experts, small community, but still people who speak the language.
Yes.
And know the history.
Don't have the benefit of serving on the terrain, and
right.
That makes a huge difference.
Absolutely.
And so much as we spend time within the government, in the intel community, in the Defense Department, in state, in White House, trying to get into the mind of the Iranian officials that we're thinking about working against or on something with occasionally, it's hard. It's hard.
So this is a loaded question, Vali, but how do you rate the sort of expert community, not in government, but outside government, in terms of accurately describing and reflecting what Iranians think about the U.S.?
I mean, first of all, just as a prelude, what Barbara was saying just now also applies to the other side. which is among key decision makers in Iran, and particularly on the hardcore of the state, their knowledge of America is also very minimal, because there's no embassy, there's nobody who served here. There's a lot of theoretical assumption from far away about trying to read the tea leaves about how Americans may understand this, how they may react to this, et cetera. And sometimes you see they make decisions that are counterproductive, like if we try to carry out a sabotage operation in Australia or in America or London, isn't that a great idea? I mean, if people are sitting in a bunker with uniforms, they may think like that.
Yes.
But if they had any sense of public diplomacy, et cetera, somebody may intervene and say, don't do that. That's the way it happens in our system. So there is that as well. I would say, I think there's a lot of wealth of knowledge, and Barbara's right, that maybe not in Washington, people who work for the US government, to the best of their knowledge, they can keep tap on through varieties of intelligence or textual material. There is a lot of wealth of knowledge, I would say, in American academia, because they actually, to a greater extent, do go to Iran. They don't have the political issues. And actually, one of the things that worries me is that the US is moving in the direction of criminalizing or closing that door, which actually is self-defeating. It doesn't hurt Iran whether a professor comes and goes or has a cousin or an aunt. But I have found that a lot of those people are a font of knowledge in terms of what's going on in Iranian society, even if not in Iranian government. I think generally with Washington as a whole, and this is not limited to Iran, you can end up in sort of in a bubble that an assumption is put out there on whether it's on Gaza or on Russia or on China or on Iran, that then is repeated enough, it becomes sort of your baseline, right? And there is a kind of an orthodoxy that then takes hold of the thinking, and sometimes it can be unimaginative. Or you cannot think out of the box, because that becomes, that's I think a problem with our think tank community. Period. And then there is no relationship really organically between the think tank community and the academic community, and that's I think why places like Crown Center are so valuable in some ways, because they can maybe help not just with Iran, let's say with Gaza, with varieties of things. I mean, I saw Shai has a piece here that you won't hear about that in Washington necessarily, right? So I think that is definitely a problem. But to your earlier point also, you said Iran has urbane diplomats. You've met many, and then it has these hard men. So one of the tragedies of this relationship is that in the past 40 years, for a country that's in the war, the way that this is unfolded, and I'm not saying blame one way or the other, this conflictual relationship has actually ended up creating and strengthening the hardcore. There has been nothing in the past, I would say, since I've been working on this, that has actually helped strengthen the urbane side. They have not delivered anything, right? The only thing they delivered was the nuclear deal, which then basically was undone. And then they went back to the table, and then there was war. So in a way, I think there is an intense debate, and they're trying desperately now to sort of change the direction right now. I think President Rouhani was the champion of the nuclear deal, is on the forefront, essentially arguing about Iran going back to the table, seriously negotiating, contemplating, making significant concessions to end this thing. But there is this massive division within Iran. And the more this is becoming conflictual, the more the men in uniform are becoming more and more powerful. The more Iran has been sanctioned, the more a country that's under sanctions relies on security forces to survive. So they have gone out of the barracks. They've taken over vast areas of the economy, either by commission or it just happens that way. And now they are the state in a way. And I think, in fact, if there is significant opening change, it's not going to be a velvet revolution. It has to come through them. I mean, I would say, it's kind of like you have to hope for an Iranian Deng Xiaoping, who was, a military man under Mao. But so complete is the institutional control. I don't want to say necessarily of all of them being the hardcore warriors, but this is a consequence of a country being 40 years at war,
Yeah.
which has become dominated by that side. But we don't actually interact with them, right? There's not just because of that, but because of also all kinds of designations and sanctions, et cetera, that there is no possibility of saying that anybody talks to somebody in the Revolutionary Guards, right? At least above the board. Let's say we talk to the urbane side, we talk to the diplomats who are not necessarily represent that side of the thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd like to just take issue a little bit with the notion that this sort of, and I would agree with your characterization that that the hard men coming out of the barracks have really infiltrated every aspect of the economy, taken over this, been fused with the state, or been a separate part of the state set up for specific reasons at the outset of the revolution and of the war with Iraq, but became this really, what I always think of as the muscular arm of Iranian foreign policy, and the MFA is this little slight, slender other arm that only does the non-important pieces or the non-kinetic pieces. But when it comes to the region, it's really the IRGC that has been the driving shaper, creator of their policy. But look where it's led them. I mean, what a catastrophe. And whatever, however you look at Gaza and that terrible war, there's no question that a corollary to this was a very successful smashing to pieces, not destroying, but really smashing up the proxy project that these hard men had built for 40 years. And what's it all been about? I mean, what has it brought? The revolution in Iran, and it hasn't driven us out of the region. The Gulf Arabs have been fretting for 15 years that we're not staying, we're leaving. But the fact is, we never do seem to leave. And as soon as there's some sort of hot crisis, whether it's in 2014 with ISIS or some other event, we're back in this. We're swinging back in. This president and this Secretary of Defense in particular, and this vice president have made it very clear they don't want that overextension militarily of the U.S. And yet, there we were in the 12-day campaign.
No,
we're if their premise is they're all exhausting the U.S., they're not. I would argue, we exhausted ourselves in 2 forever wars, but we have still maintained largely a steady state of military and certainly diplomatic engagement and diplomatic commitment to the region. And the region itself is changing, but Iran's posture towards the region until September of last year and then everything that followed had not.
No, I think you're absolutely right. That goes to the kernel of the debate today in Iran. I mean, if we stepped a little bit further back, let's say go back to October 6th, 2023, or even a little bit further back before that, they would have thought it's successful for the following reason, that they did manage, and I argue here that their main goal was that if the U.S. was very successful in Iraq where it invaded it, they would have been next. So to the extent that they maybe even colluded with Assad in terms of creating the dual insurgencies in Iraq, sectarian war, they confounded us. We survived Iraq, but definitely we were not in the mood for anything further. So they thought that actually was successful. And it's after this notion of success that the Quds force in Iran goes to become basically a behemoth even within the Revolutionary Guards. Or if you ask them now, I mean, a lot of Iranians would say, what you spend all of this money on Hezbollah and Syria, what did it win you? And the answer they would give is that, why didn't Israel bomb Iran 2 years ago? Why didn't Israel bomb Iran, 6 months before Hezbollah was toppled? Because, we really didn't have an air defense. Our air defense was Hezbollah. And while Syria was under our thumb, Israeli aircraft did not have the run of the skies to fly and, straight onto our border. It's one of those military strategies that is really successful until it's not, right? And in fact, one of the ways they put it in Iran is that it was a successful strategy for its time, but it's no longer a viable strategy. So this actually has diminished the Quds Force, I think, within the conversation. And I point, for instance, to a very interesting comments were made by Iran's civilian head of its National Security Council, Ali Larijani, who went to Lebanon and very blankly said to the Lebanese, I'm in charge of the Middle East file. I am, the way he was like I am the state, way of talking, essentially without any revolutionary, Quds Force that's sort of being there, told you that, this is very different. But where it's a problem, I think, with where Iran might go is that the Quds Force may be diminished, but now actually the focus is on that division of the IRGC that produces the missiles.
Yeah.
I actually think even if you went back to when Israel hit Iran's consulate in Damascus, the decision at that moment for Hezbollah not to retaliate, because Hezbollah still was there, it still had not been decapitated, but that Iran would retaliate from its own border. I think that's the moment where they decided that this idea of forward defense is no longer a deterrent against Israel. Hezbollah is valuable if it's scary enough to Israel that Israel actually won't test it. But once you began to see the kind of Israel that emerged post October 7th, with the determination, willingness to take risk, willingness to accept even casualties or risk casualties, but win, I think they decided that the forward defense was up. Right? In other words, you're not going to, you have to find ways to do this with missiles. And I think if there's now division of money in Iran, it's by and large going into...
Yeah, and I want to take issue with that again. Well, not take issue with your accounting of what happened so much as the implications for that. So in April, Supreme Leader green-lighted a much bigger response than was originally proposed. And it was a mix, drones, some ballistic missiles, and multiple parties involved. Iran doing a lot of it, but not all of it. And the response, and it was largely a failure because of the mustering of a defensive shield using Arab states and European, including Arab states that had not previously engaged in a defensive effort for Israel. But what was really striking to me was when the Supreme Leader, and it was a failure, and it was also the counterpunch from the Israelis very neatly demonstrated reach towards, I think it was in Natanz, wasn't it? Knocked out.
Isfahan,
yeah. Isfahan. Knocked out, some of the air defenses as just a sort of knock on the door. But it was in October that I thought it was truly foolhardy and provocative on the part of the Supreme Leader, and I've never really gotten a good explanation, including from our intel analysts, what the Supreme Leader was thinking, because at that point, first of all, he waited, finally decided to do it. Then it was almost entirely an Iranian play, and it was escalatory, because it was ballistic missiles, almost entirely ballistic missiles, a 12-minute launch to impact window. So by the nature of it, it was really, really daring the Israelis to, in a way that I thought was kind of crazy at the time. And indeed, their response was to take out almost all of the air defenses around Tehran. So that takes you to the following summer. So this is where going to the missile forces,
No, there's no question they made mistakes. I think even among them, they think they made mistakes which we don't think are mistakes. Like the big debate is they should have attacked when Haniya was killed in Tehran. Yes. They didn't.
Yeah.
There is a lot of sort of Monday morning quarterbacking, as we would say. But where they're standing, unless they actually, and this is part of the debate, unless they basically say the game is up, we're no longer going to, we need to have a completely different strategy, completely different approach to the US. There's only one element of defense left for them because the proxies are no longer a deterrence. So that only leaves the missiles essentially as, and yes, I don't think they're at a point right now that they would deter Israel. But it also depends, like, how did they read the 12-day war? We don't know, because we have a reading of it. We think that that's the way they should read it. But it's not a given. And I say this, you have to always understand the psychology of the other side. This generation of Revolutionary Guard commanders and the supreme leader are veterans of the Iran-Iraq war. Their experience, and this was really formative, they had no experience of statecraft when that war happened, was that the first battles in the war is not the war.
Yeah.
Right? So for 2 years, Iraq was occupying Iranian territory. Surviving Iraqi attack was victory. And then they figured out how they would basically use asymmetric warfare, human wave attacks, et cetera, to push Iraq out. I mean, that's a sort of a dominant view. I think one of the issues with the 12-day war is that they didn't come out of it feeling defeated. They're like a boxer that was punched, it fell, but it wasn't knocked out. And now it sees that there's a possibility to take this to 15 rounds. And there's a lot of rounds to be played, and we're only like in the third and fourth round. And it is that kind of a calculation that can sometimes get them into a difficult point. I mean, those who are arguing we need a completely different path, like Rouhani, are basically saying, just don't fight. Don't bank on this long run. You won't be able to sustain it either. You should just find a way to finish this off, negotiate. The other side says, first of all, President Trump hasn't put anything on the table that we can negotiate. Right now, he just basically wants surrender. He doesn't want to deal. And secondly, no, we should stick in it, with it, and see how this evolves going forward. Along with missiles, there's always an open question of what they might do with their nuclear program. I don't think they're doing anything right now because they're not ready to do anything, but they're also not giving up the whole idea of having a nuclear program either. So it's kind of like that wait and see. It might be a year before they make a decision or 2 years before they make a decision. But I think their inclination, what's in their DNA, is that they're not looking or expecting quick victory. This is a long slug. But I think enough of Iranians and enough people in Iranian leadership are tired of, after 40 years, the long war, not just the 12-day war.
That's what I mean, the long war.
And also, they don't believe it's sustainable. They really don't believe that the country can actually keep doing it.
And also, what is the objective?
Well, I mean, the objective is different here, but in fact, that is also open to question. And I would say, partly it goes to also how we handle this. The U.S. has to think very, very hard about this. What works best at this moment in Iran? More pressure, or engaging in a way that actually would deepen this rift in Iran, right? If there's something really serious at the table to debate, then it might be quite different than when there is nothing on the table other than you surrender. Yeah. So I think the assumption of the Trump administration is let the maximum pressure work. Now there's snapback sanctions. Let them sit under this. And I'm not saying necessarily we should, but if you're trying to screw with the mind of your enemy, pressure is one way. The other is to try to actually create an elite rift in Iran. And Iran, I think, is primed for that elite rift right now because the questions facing the country are, for the first time, really, really momentous. And so this is something we've always been waiting for, that change will come only when the elite fracture.
And that's the irony of sanctions and conflict. On one hand, it strengthens the hardliners, strengthens their resolve. On the other hand, without sanctions and conflict, you wouldn't have this debate inside Iran about changing their entire approach. And I think the challenge for the Trump administration, which I don't think they're up to, is trying to come up with a clever way to exploit that.
Well,
because from there, and this goes to the nuclear issue has always been the dominant concern for the U.S. I don't think it was manufactured. I think presidents really felt that was, an existential issue. If you believe, as Trump does, that the nuclear issue is off the table, then what incentive does the administration have to actually try to do something clever?
No, I fully understand that. I would say, yes, that's perhaps true. There's two ways of thinking about it. One, to say, You really need to close this knot. You know, the IEA needs to be back in Iran. You need to be present. You cannot just assume that because you kick them really hard and they're on the ground, that you could just ignore them, right? The other way of thinking about it, and this goes back to your question about, thinking in Washington versus academia. I think, if I may say, that there's much more thinking about dealing with an immediate problem. But I think Iran is at a phase where you need to, in the long run, see, like the way we did with the Soviet Union or China, can the United States actually have a broader policy than just a nuclear issue about how you bring this country out from the cold?
Yeah.
Right? And that might require, which I'm not saying we're equipped with that right now, but that's sort of a wish that, you could get this right. Already sort of try to seed the ground for what might come after Khamenei, what is the strategy? Even if we looked at the examples of China and Russia, what worked at the end of the Soviet Union, as opposed to saying, how do we just micromanage, how do we get this 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium out of Iran, and then we don't want to be bothered with it.
Okay, so this has been a great discussion and a terrific back and forth. So I want to invite people to ask questions. We always like to have students have first preference. So there's a microphone here. If you would like to ask a question, say who you are. And just remember that a question ends in a question mark. Anybody interested? Yeah, yes, please.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you so much for a very interesting conversation. My name is Bahman Khodadadi. I'm a postdoc research fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. I have a questions regarding sort of what I call shear dynamics. And I would like to know and learn more about what sort of dynamics do you think exists within sort of Shiism, as like a institutional dynamics within Shiism that might, play a role in this sort of existing debate in Iran. And so, in particular, what sort of religious institution within this sort of dynamic do you think can play a role in shaping the debate and sort of contribute to changing, the sort of existing debate? Thank you.
I mean, that is also open to debate itself, exactly because of the collapse of Hezbollah and the collapse of the axis of resistance. I would say there is the people's religious level institutional relationships, let's say centered in Najaf, Ayatollah Sistani, etc., which is very much there. It's robust. It has been expanding. There's now connectivity between different Shia communities because the Middle East had opened up after 2003 and 2014. There's a celebration in Iraq by the Arba'in. Every year it's got bigger. This year, I think 21 million people participated. They come from across the region. So that's very much there. But the other institutional sort of linkage was the one that the Quds Force set up, which is the sort of Shia crescent, Shia axis of resistance. That definitely has collapsed, so it's not clear what would replace it. And then within individual countries, like within Lebanon, the sort of the balance of power between Hezbollah and the state, other communities, et cetera, is all up for question now in this debate. In Iraq, it might reopen. The fact that Syria has gone back under Sunni domination, if you would, backed by Turkey and Saudi Arabia, is part of this picture. And then interestingly, after the 12-day war, Iran's own language has become much more Iranian nationalism. And the sort of what the fabric that right now connects the people to the state, to the extent that there is, it's not about Islam or Shiism, it's about Iranian nationalism. So all of this is happening at the same time. So I don't think it's clear. And then there's a serious succession issue. So Hassan Nasrallah was killed. Khamenei is at a transition point, and Ayatollah Sistani, by all accounts, maybe in the last months of his life. So both at the sort of the political, military sort of leadership is changing. So it's not very clear who emerges in place of Nasrallah and Khamenei to speak for the muscular, if you would, regional Shiism. And the singular most important cleric who has connected Shiism on the sort of people's level is also passing, and who will replace him in Najaf and what kind of a authority that person might have, that's also not known. So, there's a number of things coming together, which is the outcome of the 2-year war that we are seeing, plus the fact that this transition of leadership is also happening at the same time.
Barbara, why don't you talk about how the Arab countries, especially the Gulf Arab countries, view Iran after the collapse of the axis of resistance, after the 12-day war. Do they see opportunities there?
Well, they have been trying to see opportunities for several years now. I was thinking about this the other day. In January, it will be 10 years from the time when then I think he was still Deputy Crown Prince. No, maybe he had just been elevated. Mohammed bin Salman essentially declared diplomatic war on Iran because of this execution of a Saudi Shia, Nimr al-Nimr, which sparked popular assaults on the Saudi embassy and the Saudi consulate in Iran. They sacked them, burned them. And the Saudis asked all the GCC states to break relations. They didn't all remove their ambassadors. Most of them downgraded, but the Saudis and the Bahrainis closed their missions, and there was a downgrading. Over time, different Gulf states began to, mostly out of fear, in the wake of the not-so-veiled attack by Iran on Saudi Aramco in September 2019, most of them began to do diplomatic outreach to try to deal with Iran diplomatically. And that accelerated over time when the Biden administration came in January 2021. Saudis basically said, we're thinking to do a similar kind of outreach with Iran. Do you have any objections? And we said, of course not. Do it. I mean, any way you could pursue your interests non-kinetically, it's a good thing. So at this point, only Bahrain doesn't have a formal, doesn't have an ambassador there, and that's because the Iranians have been sort of log rolling on that. But they have all been trying to manage Iran through these channels, and it's a real reversal from where they were 10, 15 years ago. There's still the occasional, frankly, thuggishness on the Iranians' part in terms of threat-making at points of tension with Israel or the U.S., where they will very explicitly tell them, as I've heard from several Gulf officials, several different countries, if you allow the Israelis or if you allow the Americans, you're going to hear the sound of breaking glass in X city. And of course, you saw these attacks by both the Houthi and various Iraqi militias before October 7th in a sort of display that they were not really, the Gulf countries wondered, was this Iran trying to get our attention, or is this they don't have control over their proxies? At this point, they are all deeply, deeply focused on their economic diversification away from fossil fuel economies, and they want a becalmed region. So whatever they can do, they will do to help in that regard. They were horrified by the 12-day campaign, deeply relieved that Trump called it timeout, just the day or so after the U.S. dropped the mop on the 3 sites. And they're anxious that Iran's regional activities, having been knocked about, again, not destroyed, but pretty well broken up, and they've said this to us, Israel's the new hegemon, it appears. Iran, we don't want a hegemon of any kind. We didn't want Iran to be the hegemon, and we certainly don't want Israel to take its place.
Any other questions? Yes, please. Anybody can ask a question. It's open now. Go ahead.
Thank you. I apologize if you've already addressed this, but where is the women life freedom movement in all of this? How's that been developing? Is that becoming more or less effective? And are they trying to appeal to, or are they getting appeals from the United States or Israel, or are they trying to stay independent of that, or do they have like sort of the same kind of cynicism?
I mean, in a way, first of all, when a country is at war, the issues of war and peace is separate from social issues. But in a way, the women won. I mean, they came out to do away with hijab, and actually what they've achieved is beyond expectations that one would have had at that point in time. I mean, a friend of mine in Europe said, he went to the Iranian embassy in Paris, and there's no hijab inside the embassy. There's no hijab in government places. There's no hijab in society. There's no enforcement of it. So they won. In other words, and a cause, if you win the cause, then it's not the same cause. I mean, obviously, there was an expectation that this would evolve into regime change and something a lot bigger. That didn't happen. If something like that comes back, it's going to be under a different banner, like bread, food, jobs, or demands for democratic rights, etc. But that particular movement, I think it's very important to note, it actually won. The massive transformation that's happened in Iranian society was led by the women who came out, by the sacrifices they made, and the regime relented. Even before the Israeli attack, it had started to relent. After that, it literally, as sort of the dam broke. But on the other side, I would say, one of the surprises that came out of the war is that the Iranian people were not ready to side with an invading force. So maybe the assumption outside was that there would be a mass uprising in Iran, or there would be, you decapitate the revolutionary guards from the top, and the people will take advantage and come out. And this dislike and hatred of the Islamic Republic did not mean necessarily that they were prepared to take Israel's side in that sense. And I think there is reluctance to be an instrument from the outside. But by and large, the movement, it achieved its goals. So it is. I don't think it's a live issue in Iran. I mean, there are a lot of other issues. Bread and butter issues are very key. Political repression is still there. There's still tons of political prisoners who are in prison. But that particular issue is not one that actually people would rally because the goals was achieved.
Yes, Shai. We can hear
shout
you.
at us.
First of all, thank you, because you've given me so many things to think about. Correct me if I'm mistaken, but my impression especially from the opening statements that you made, is that you see on both sides rather continuity in terms of mutual perceptions, in terms of the basic policies, in terms of the basic premises driving the policies, and so on and so forth. Now, to me, I'm a little baffled by this, because to me, for example, it means that the Iranians don't actually see what I think Vali says is around the corner, but not there yet, that there is an opportunity for them now. Because, in fact, the administrations are not exactly identical. That, in fact, in 2003, they actually thought that they were next. And they were next because they read the newspapers, and they read that there was something called the neocons. And they said, there is a commitment now to regime change in the region. I would very much like to know how the Iranians read the day 10, 11, and 12 of the 12-day war. Because what happened on us on these days is that President Trump made it very, very clear to Netanyahu that he was not going to support any kind of action that is aimed at regime change. And this idea of bombing the entrance to Evin prison and so on and so forth, basically, the U.S. was not with Israel on this. And Trump forced Netanyahu to get those 50 airplanes back because the defense minister was already starting to talk about regime change and so on. So that's a big contrast to and I think Netanyahu, by the way, I think in 2020 was terrified by the idea that Trump would get reelected because he was convinced that Trump is going to try to get a deal with Iran. And he's still now not sure where Trump is because he's both. So the question is, if I'm right that it's not a complete continuity, then so the question is, do the Iranians agree with me that there's an opportunity now, or are they so much prisoners of their basic premises that they're sort of immobile at this point? To me, the reason I say this is, I use the word baffling, is because I always thought, you look at Trump in the first administration, and you see how a country that is probably much more isolated than regarding the United States than Iran is, which is North Korea, its leader learned how to play Trump, how to manipulate. And in contrast, the Iranians seem immobile, and that's what I find baffling.
I mean, obviously, the thinking of an individual leaders here also matters. So, as I said, the shadow of Khamenei and the way he reads this is pretty prominent. I think at the macro level, and I'm not saying they're getting the facts correct or the interpretations is correct, they believe that the variations between U.S. administrations are cosmetic. That to them there is a United States, the way that they say there's an Israel. There's not real difference between Bibi or the Labour Party on a fundamental thing. It's not as if you had a Labour Party, it's like going to give you Ehud Barak's just going to give you a Palestinian state tomorrow. So sometimes they would say, and again, I'm just paraphrasing what's out there, that like it was under Clinton that the Iran-Libya Act was passed. Or, so in other words, it's not like some of the fundamentals actually changed. And then you have I think it's important to think. I think Iran as a country, generally, my assumption is a insecure country in a region in which it's alone. It's not Arab. The Arabs don't accept it. They didn't under the Shah. They don't do today, and they're not going to do tomorrow. It's also Shia. It's not part of the mainstream religion of the region, and it has and this sense of loneliness was particularly evident during the 12-day war. It's on its own. And so it is deeply timid, if you would, and it's deeply suspicious of the United States. So if you start with Khamenei already sort of with this anti-imperialist view that the U.S. wants to do us harm, it's out there to get us, this is not about opening up, they're tricking us, etc., then you try things, and some things work and some things don't. But I think the master narrative today in Iran is what happened with the nuclear deal, right? And then what happened also when they were in the midst of negotiations. So, you would say if they really had not trusted Trump in these negotiations, these generals would not be sleeping at home with their kids that night, right? If they had really thought that this is a ruse, at least enough of them were watching television when the Israeli drones came. And therefore, they were caught off guard. And so that's a huge overhang. But I still think they do think that they don't have a choice but to try the water. And I think, for instance, when their foreign minister went to New York for United Nations, he was given authorization to even meet with Witkoff face-to-face, right? And to try to arrive at a negotiation. But what they found out is that President Trump is actually not interested in a deal, is interested in surrender, which to them is now something very different. yes, I think part of the tragedy of Iran is that it has held on to, it has not been entrepreneurial enough with the United States. It has had this sort of grand assumptions about the US. I would also say something else is pretty important, is that for a long time, the Iranians have always been conflicted about where does Israel fit in this. So initially, much more the argument was that, there's a great Satan, there's a little Satan, and the little Satan is basically the instrument of great Satan. So don't waste time on Israel. It's the United States. They're increasingly coming to understanding that this is much more complicated. And I think where their policy, even under President Obama and to today, is failing, is that they think they can have a deal with the United States and be at war with Israel at the same time. Right? And this does not work. Sadat figured this out. Others figured it out that you cannot have this. In fact, the path to Washington goes through Jerusalem. It's not the other way around. And I think this is such a fundamental problem for them, especially now that they've gone to war with Israel, that it requires a complete rethink of their whole worldview about how to handle the United States.
Barbara, you're in Washington, do you want to say something about what you see from the Trump administration? Are there people in the administration who would be receptive to Vali's argument?
Well, so I think you heard quite a bit before and even during the 12-day war and after, the usual kind of conflicting messages from President Trump, sort of, but definitely laying out this notion that there's a broader relationship here, economic riches for all that we could both enjoy, a sort of the kind of the grand bargain, rapprochement, which I have to think horrifies Khamenei when he hears that coming out of an American president's mouth. And however that may not be something that he's operationally pursuing, he's nonetheless thrown it out there. And I find it completely within the bounds of the possible that he will instruct Steve Witkoff at some point to try to just, let's go for something big. Let's not futz around with just this nuclear thing, and anyway, we took care of it. Let's go for something bigger. Now, does that have any traction? I don't know, given where the regime is feeling itself and given the Supreme Leader's long-standing, deeply rooted convictions, that are really part and parcel of him. But when I think about the possibilities out there, not being giddily optimistic that they're upon us, but I think there are a lot of factors that can come into play that do alter it. One is the Supreme Leader passes on to his reward, and then you have something else, perhaps a system that doesn't necessarily immediately become more IRGC-like, but perhaps the presidency, depending on who comes in as the successor, has a greater weight. In other words, something could happen on the domestic side, and things are happening and have already happened on the regional side that I would just hope that eventually Iranian policymakers would really look hard at this, at what's going on around them. I mean, we saw this just terrible piece today, with Pezeshkian calling for moving Tehran and just picking up and moving the capital because it is so depleted of water. They have so ravaged their aquifer that there's terrible subsidence and sinkholes and things like that. But they're running out of water in that immediate area. There's nothing to be done about it of an immediate solution. They can't possibly afford to do something like that. But this is a sort of crisis that they're in that is going to push them increasingly to the war. Meanwhile, on the rim, right across the way in Saudi Arabia, you've got the FII, Davos in the desert. All they talked about this week was AI and the future and pointing towards the future and trying to not just prepare but push their society forward in that direction. They've got the wealth. They're trying to put it to that. Iran once upon a time had that wealth, but But, they don't have that proxy network to fall back on. They really don't have their ballistic missile program that's going to do them much good in the meantime. They have no air defenses. It's really time for a good, hard think. And it's completely possible to me that this president, given his penchant for very unconventional approaches, could say, I'm going to send Steve Witkoff to Tehran. And he's going to have to find, somebody to meet, but I want him to sit down and talk through all the magnificent arrangements that we could come to. I'm not pretending that's an easy or feasible scenario, but I think there are certainly some moving pieces here that could move unexpectedly in the next couple of years, given the president that we have.
What would the Supreme Leader say if Trump asked him for a meeting? He'd run in the other direction as fast as he could.
That's actually true. I mean, partly is actually the question of trust right now. I think once you fool me once, shame on you. You fool me twice, shame on me. I think he's in that point that he's been fooled now twice. But I don't think is insurmountable. I think ultimately it is. I would say at a tactical level, there's a very different sort of approach to this. One is the Iranians think you build a deal bottom up, day by day. It actually reminds me of the book our friend Martin Indyk wrote about Kissinger, about how every document he wrote had to go through a Talmudic level, vetting in Israel before it would move forward. Iranians actually operate like that, as you know, with the nuclear deal. I mean, Trump is basically says approaches say yes, and then we'll figure it out.
Yes, helicopter in.
Yeah, and actually the Supreme Leader answered this in a comments the other day. He said that, this man says, he wants to first agree on what's the outcome of an agreement, and then have an agreement. That's called an imposition of a dictate. It's not actually a deal making. But I agree with you. I think all of that is possible, largely because of where Iran is. It cannot really afford not to look at any offer that comes from the other side seriously, provided that it's a serious offer. So it's a question of whether President Trump at some point will think that this is necessary, or let's say the rest of the Gulf says that this kind of a situation we're in is not tenable.
Well, I think it's you put it, wrapping up that tying the knot or what have you in the nuclear program. You can't leave it as it is. I think eventually that reality will come to this administration, that if you just say it's pretty much taken care of, the Israelis are likely to have a different point of view, and they may launch another military effort to make that point. So it is unresolved. It has to be resolved one way or the other, lest you leave a real point of instability there.
I agree.
But maybe it's time to move beyond the nuclear issue. You said that, Trump may see this not as tying up the loose ends of the nuclear program, but a fresh business opportunity.
Or just a big, exciting, big deal that, it's, again, part of the peace, doing a different kind of peace.
Right.
Yeah.
Do the Iranians do cryptocurrency?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's partly, apparently, is one of the reasons there's electricity shortage in Iran. But they're not doing it in order to invest internationally. It's actually, they use it. But there are, I guess part of the problem here, one can imagine a way out, but part of the problem is there are some countries that cannot do Trump. I mean, look at India and Pakistan.
Right.
Who would have had the thought that the Pakistanis would be so nimble in doing everything that is required to flatter the president? They've already nominated him for Nobel Prize twice. They've they've played the game of crypto. They've done everything, and the Indians simply just cannot bring themselves to play that game. And so, it's just not in the DNA of the Iranian system to basically be able to play that game. And that may end up being a tragedy here. In other words, it requires a different kind of nimbleness on the other side, which they're not good at.
Yeah, we have a long.
Let's ask students. Go ahead, please.
That's true. That's true.
Hello. Thank you. My name is Aaron. Thank you, Professor Ambassador, for being here. I wanted to ask Professor, you used the metaphor of a boxing bout to kind of describe or contextualize the current conflict. I'm curious to, if we're in round 3 or 4 currently, what would a round 5 or round 6 look like for the Iranians? And then, Ambassador, for the Americans, a similar question. What would be the objectives of a Witkoff visit to Tehran?
So, I mean, who knows? It could be, the next round could be much bloodier, much more devastating on both sides. I mean, sometimes the problem of wars is that, we think they shouldn't do it, but the two sides are not exhausted themselves. They may think they can get the upper hand going forward. I would say that if this war continues between Iran and Israel, it may not just be a simple tit for tat. Next round might be bigger because the Iranians feel like now they have to do something bigger, whether they can or not, in order to establish what they call in Iran a balance of terror with Israel, because they don't have that anymore once Hezbollah fell, and that's a very risky endeavor for them. Unfortunately, their conclusion is that the boxing match is not over. So long as there are rounds, they're still in it. Then the other question is, whether will Israel end up in a situation that thinks that this might be a long bout and might have a different theory about how to handle Iran. And let's not forget, Israel is a nuclear-armed state. I mean, it's not like Iran can just basically vanquish Israel at some point. I mean, there are thresholds that can actually be crossed, which one should be mindful. I mean, I was watching this new movie by Catherine Bigelow.
House of Dynamite.
And constantly I was thinking about the 12-day war, not just because it was missiles and interceptors, but exactly the kind of a calculation that a country might make, which is the premise here of launching nuclear weapons. So, we're in a war that one side does have nuclear warheads, and the other side is bigger. If it begins to sort of cross that, we may be in a completely different realm here.
Barbara?
Well, so I'm not suggesting I have insight as to next steps on the part of the administration, but I don't exclude the possibility that President Trump will at some point return to the Iran portfolio and say, why are we've done this, why don't we do something else? And, he's thrown out the idea at least several times of, broader peace. We could imagine the Iranians and Israelis sitting down together. And I could just hear the sound of exploding heads in Jerusalem and Tehran at that point. But still, I mean, if you start from the premise, as many do, that the unresolved issue of the Palestinian quest for statehood is one of the points of friction that is instability in the region. I also think Iran's unresolved status, unresolved on its own part in the region, on the rim, not quite in, very lonely, as Vali said, but lonely for some very good reasons, having some very few and very bad friends, North Korea, Russia. So that unresolved status of Iran 40-some years after the revolution also needs addressing.
We're running short on time, but why don't I take 2 questions, the next 2, yeah.
Hello, thank you so much for this session. My name is Ali and I'm an international student from Pakistan. My question is very simple. We talked about mistrust, we talked about conflict, how about conflict resolution? My main question is how we can, or what steps can be taken to create trust between US, Israel, and Iran? Thank you.
And then go ahead and ask your question as well, yes. Thank you.
Thank you. I suppose, given what we know about Iran and what we have observed, its isolation, its own internal question of what it means to be both the birth of a new Islamic theocracy and also the inheritor of the Persian Empire, and at the same time, based on this ideology that at any point the regime could collapse via a 1953-style imposition. With all of this being what seems to be motivating Iran, does it make sense to say that Iran even has a grand strategy in the first place?
Go ahead.
I mean, grand strategy essentially, it's not contingent on problems that countries face. In fact, the more problems they have, the more likely to have a grand view of how they deal with it. And everything that you said is actually being the germs of the way in which Iran has thought about how it deals with all of these things. So it had a master narrative, let's put it that way, that we basically need to get rid of the United States inside Iran from around our borders, even get rid of it in the region, that we organize our resources, ideological, cultural, economic, political, military, all around this objective. So the key question is not whether these problems negate having a grand strategy. The question now is that the grand strategy that they have is no longer addressing these problems and perhaps is aggravating these problems. So you might say that they either have to set it aside, upgrade it, or adopt something altogether different. And I think what I would say, I don't think they right now think their assumptions about the U.S., et cetera, was wrong. I think everything was validated for them. The U.S. attacked them, et cetera. I think the important thing to think about at this moment is that we shouldn't think about Iran as an unchanging monolith. And we should really take seriously, the fissures, the fractures, the debates in it. And it's important that the U.S. has a grand strategy, which I don't think we do. We have, troubleshooting strategies with Iran. But as important as large a country as this is, as Barbara says, on the rim of the Middle East, country of 90 million people, where it's located geostrategically, et cetera, do we have a grand strategy of basically, let's say if our goal is to bring Iran in from the cold, repeat what happened in China and Russia, do we have a grand strategy? And on the other point, and I think that's more your bailiwick about how you build trust, but I think at least between U.S. and Iran, Israel, I think is a much more difficult nut to crack right now between Iran and Israel. But you actually have to have some first deals that survive and both sides can point to and say this worked, the other side did its part. So in a way, President Obama's deal could have been that. We have to go back to that.
Yeah, I would just add, one of my frustrations, points of frustration over a number of administrations was sort of the cautiousness, the narrowness of administrations, that there was not a greater boldness from the outset, which is, again, is not to underestimate the height of the mountain that we would have to climb in terms of confidence, trust, et cetera. But that's a given. When you sit down with an adversary, you have no trust. I mean, you don't go through a lot of counseling and so forth before you get to the negotiation table. You kind of grit your teeth and you get there. You do your prep work. You talk to people who know your adversary. You try to find folks who are fairly agenda-free, which is, frankly, hard in the region. Everybody's got their own views on Iran, but then you get to it. The really awkward situation we've been in now repeatedly across two administrations is the refusal to talk directly to U.S. negotiators. Now, eventually that was kind of broken, semi-broken, but they're back to saying, no, we're only going to, have the Omanis or somebody shuttling between hotel rooms for us. That's ludicrous. I mean, you have to sit down, you have to have continuous, I think, expansive discussions that get beyond one set of issues. And yes, I agree, find something on which you could come to terms, and it doesn't have to be, the hardest nut to crack, nuclear or what have you. Pick something else. Pick a climate, or maybe not this administration, but pick an issue. Sorry.
That's why I said cryptocurrency.
No, but I mean, you pick something that is of large mutual interest in the immediate neighborhood, and water and climate are huge issues, and the increasing salination of the Gulf because of everybody's desal plants and so forth, and the lack of fresh water that Iran's suffering from. I don't know, you could come up with some things, but I agree, it doesn't suit this regime to have a U.S. administration helicoptering in and just throwing lots of big ideas from top down, not building up. But this administration does things in its way, and it may be that a very unconventional approach, but that still is direct and continuous discussions, I think is the only way to go. You're not going to build confidence otherwise. And we are woefully out of practice in negotiating with the Iranians. We had one burst of activity there for the JPOA and JCPOA, but that's it across 40-some years. So we're really out of practice, and we're not going to get back into practice except for a direct engagement, which is why I've long since argued for getting a small interest section established in Tehran and an Iranian interest section here in Washington.
So I think we'll end on that somewhat optimistic note. I want to join me, please, in thanking our two speakers. Thank you, everybody. Please help yourself.